Good afternoon. On behalf of the Critical Race Initiative, thank you for joining us here at the second annual Congressman Parren Mitchell Symposium here at the University of Maryland. I'd also like to welcome those who are tuning in via our live stream and those who have been joining in with us on these very important discussions through our Twitter chat. My name is Wendy Marie Laybourne, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology and the chair of the Critical Race Initiative. It's very apropos that we are here today at the Parren Mitchell Symposium, given events that are happening around the country, but specifically in Baltimore. Mitchell was born, raised, and continued to reside in Baltimore during his time as a congressman. He was a tireless champion for justice and equality and never lost his sense of outrage at the racism that existed and continues to exist today. And we have seen that same outrage expressed through protesters in Ferguson, in New York, and just a few miles away in Baltimore. Lest we think the state violence that spurred these protests and uprisings are isolated incidents, disconnected from each other, disconnected from history, let me share a few words that Parren Mitchell addressed to student protesters in 1977. There comes a time in the lives of oppressed people when you must decide not to retreat. Now is that time for us to draw the line and say, we will retreat no further. We are talking about more than just one case, but a system which attempts to keep the masses contained by keeping them out of work and robbing them of their manhood, and a system which tries to control students by putting them in all-white universities and putting 50% of them on probation and the rest of them out. These words, spoken nearly 40 years ago, remain relevant. And in this second panel, we will discuss the themes of activism, equality, and criminalization present in Parren Mitchell's words and pertinent today. I am honored to introduce Delegate Alonzo Washington, the moderator for this panel on social justice and the pursuit of equality in the era of mass criminalization. Delegate Washington has been a member of the House of Delegates since 2012 and represents District 22, which covers Prince George's County. He is a lifelong resident of PG County who graduated from the University of Maryland, College Park with a BA in criminal justice. He began his public service career as the community liaison for Prince George's County Councilman Will Campos. After 2 years, he became the youngest chief of staff on the county council and was a leading force in affordable housing, economic and community development, and government reform. Through his service and experiences on the various levels of government, Delegate Washington has a unique perspective on how to best serve the public. He is poised to prepare PG County to tackle major initiatives such as reforming the school system, attracting the FBI, and developing the Purple Line. Please join me in welcoming Delegate Alonzo Washington.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Sheesh, man, soft crowd here. All right, my name is Alonzo Washington. I'm a state delegate in Prince George's County, as she just mentioned. This is such a timely discussion for the recent events that occurred here. I want to first welcome you to the social justice and pursuit of equality in the era of mass communication. I want to also thank the Department of Sociology's Critical Race Initiative for inviting me to be today's moderator. It's quite an honor to be a leader in this discussion. Also just want to tell you just a little bit more about myself at being a delegate. We just concluded the legislative session in Annapolis about 2 weeks ago. We have 90 days out of the year where we go to Annapolis to pass laws and ultimately pass the state budget. But for me, I was appointed 2 years ago by our next president, Martin J. O'Malley. That was a joke. I was also won my first election just last year in 2014. Where I became the #1 vote getter in our district, and been happy to represent those areas of Greenbelt, Riverdale Park, New Carrollton, and a host of other municipalities and non-incorporated areas in the county. Now I serve as the chair of the Law Enforcement Subcommittee for Prince George's County. I'm also the first vice chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, and I'm the deputy majority whip in the House of Delegates. So just after 2 years, my team and I have been able to move up in leadership in the House of Delegates, and we're pretty proud of that because we have a lot of issues that we want to tackle, including social justice, and this is going to enable me to be able to do that in the House of Delegates. The other thing I want to let you know is that we're gonna take this panel. First, I'm gonna introduce all of our panelists first, and then we're gonna have each one of our panelists come up in this order to give about 3 to 5 minutes of opening remarks, and then we're gonna open it up for questions. And also, you can follow me on Twitter and follow me on Twitter at Delegate ATW. So when you ask your questions, you can include that. And also, we're doing hashtag Parren 15, Parren 15, please. So the first we have up is Jasmine Mickens. Jasmine Mickens is a policy assistant for civil, criminal, and racial justice reform at the Open Society Foundations. Growing up in Newark, New Jersey, and Brooklyn, New York, she brings her lived experience to influence the public policy debate for justice reform. She has a track record of promoting systemic change through research and community engagement, from serving as an ethnographic researcher at the University of Cape Town, Yale University, and as a Congressional Hunger Fellow. Jasmine is also a proud New Jersey Seed Scholar and Rosa Parks Award recipient. Please give it up for Ms. Jasmine Mickens. Also, we have Dr. Joseph Richardson. Dr. Richardson joined the African American Studies faculty in August 2006. His research interests focus on how disadvantaged youth and families living in urban communities develop, manage, and utilize social capital and their social networks to move out of poverty. Much of his research focuses on the social, cultural, and structural factors that impact African American men, including employment, education, incarceration, fatherhood, and health. His current research interest focuses on the social context of juvenile reentry and the reintegration of young African American males into schools, the workforce, communities, and families following incarceration. This work also identifies the gaps in social and mental health services for juvenile offenders returning from detention. Please give a round of applause for Dr. Joseph Richardson. We also have Dr. Kanisha Bond. Dr. Bond teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on terrorism, civil war, social movements, and research methods. She is currently engaged in a research project examining how power and identity politics influence the development and maintenance of security alliances among violent political organizations. A key feature of this project is the collection and analysis of an original data set that includes information on power and identity characteristics for more than 200 non-state actors in the Western Hemisphere from 1940 to 2008, as well as information on their collaborative relationships. She is currently working on a book manuscript based on this project. Please give it a round for Dr. Bond, please. We also have my new friend, Dr. Opal Tometi. Ms. Tometi is a transnational Black feminist writer, communication strategist, and cultural organizer who has been active in social movements for over a decade. In March 2015, the LA Times named her new civil rights leader in the 21st century. Ms. Tometi is a co-founder of the hashtag Black Lives Matter. The historical political project and Leaderful Network was launched in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin in order to explicitly combat implicit bias and anti-Black racism, and to protect and affirm the beauty and dignity of all Black lives. Ms. Tometi is currently at the helm of the country's leading Black organizations for immigrant rights, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and a national organization that educates and advocates to further immigrant rights and racial justice, together with African American, Afro-Latino, African, and Caribbean immigrant communities. Please give it a round of applause for Opal Tometi. As you can see, we have a very impressive talented panel here. I'm first ask Ms. Jasmine Mickens to come up to give about 2 to 5 minutes introductory speech. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me today to speak at this critical moment on this very critical issue. And before I get started, I just want to say that the thoughts that I am expressing do not reflect those of Open Society Foundations. The What brings me to this work is my lived experience. So for me, this is not a pet project or a cool cause, but it reflects what I live every day. This really came full circle for me in August 2009 when I found myself in front of a judge pleading for leniency for my brother who was going to be sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for a low-level drug offense. My family had no idea that anybody could even speak on behalf of the defendant, and we watched the case before him. It was a young white man who had pretty much embezzled over $1 million. And his mom got up in front of the judge and said, you know, please be lenient with my son. We'll pay back the money. We'll do whatever it takes. We just want to get my son home. And this young man was sentenced to home detention, so he went home with his family after that. So we thought that my brother, when he was about to be sentenced, that there was a chance he could come home as well. And of course, my family looked at me and said, well, hey, you're the one who is in college. You're the smart one. You did oratorical competitions when you were like 6, so you got to speak in front of this judge. And I was terrified because I didn't know what to say to the judge, but I told him about the impact of mass incarceration that was flooding communities across the country and what that would mean for my family. And when I looked in the corner of my eye, I saw my brother. His hands and feet were shackled, and he was in a pink jumpsuit, which I later learned that meant that he had just gotten out of solitary confinement for a year. But after I pled to the judge, he was sentenced to 15 years in the highest security prison in the country in Florence, Colorado. And my family's from New York, so that was like totally, we thought we would never see him again. But it was like hearing that and being in that moment made me realize my purpose and my voice and the role I need to play in this movement. And realizing that having my brother shipped away was like a slave being sold away from his family. So that was August 2009. August 2010, and I want you to think about these 3 questions when I tell you this quick story. What would you do if you saw your loved one being beat by police right in front of your eyes? What would you do? Who would you call? And would you stand there and watch as your loved one is being beat, and these could be their last moments? So August 2010, I was a student at NYU. I went home to visit my family in New Jersey. And my brother and I, it was a nice summer night, we're standing outside on the side porch, and there's like a gate between the sidewalk and the yard. And as he and I are just standing there talking, we see a plainclothes police officer come to the gate, and he's like, I'm patrolling the neighborhood, and I need to come through this gate and, you know, just check out the premises. So my brother and I looked at each other confused, like, is he really a cop? And why did he choose us, this house, out of all the houses in the neighborhood? So my brother looks at me, I look at him, and then he tells the officer, well, this is private property. You don't have a warrant, and you don't have probable cause, so I can't do that. Literally within a split second, this officer bashed my brother in the head with a nightstick. And as the blood was coming down into his eyes, I was just like shocked, and he defended himself against this officer because now it was life or death. And as soon as he started to defend himself, a gang of other officers came in and started fighting him too. And that's when I thought of Rodney King, and I was like, okay, I need to go in the house, and I ran in the house to get the rest of my family members and to get my camera. And by the time we got out, we saw a limp, handcuffed body in a pool of blood surrounded by officers. One officer had him in a headlock, another officer had him in a chokehold, and another officer was kicking him in the stomach. So naturally, my parents ran to my brother's aid, and before they even got to him, they got arrested for obstruction of justice. At that moment, everybody in my neighborhood, other family members, literally had to fight the cops off of my brother because they would have let him die, like just bleed to death, because he's still bleeding and handcuffed. And so in that moment, you know, the question is, what did justice look like? Well, it took the officer less than 2 minutes to bludgeon my brother in the head. But it took them over 2 hours to get him to any type of emergency medical services. They had him in the car, had him in the cell, and my family members had to literally say, you need to get my brother to an emergency room where he's gonna die. And when he later got to the hospital, he received 22 stitches and 5 staples in his head. He was also prosecuted and convicted of assaulting an officer and for inciting a riot. And then he later lost his job after missing several days for the trial. The rest of my family members, my mother, my father, and my my twin brother, my little brother, aunt, uncle, they were also arrested and prosecuted. And between my mom, my dad, and everybody, it was just me out there on that sidewalk that night trying to figure out how to put the pieces together. And so when I went to bail everybody out, now I'm a college student. Everybody's bail came up to like over $1 million. So I went and I had to empty my little bank account for the money that I was trying to save up for school so I didn't have to work 3 jobs. And I signed my life away to the bail bondsman. So, and then last, when I went to the police precinct to collect everyone's belongings, they said, well, you can file a complaint with internal affairs. So basically, the cops said, we'll investigate ourselves and pretty much tell you we did nothing wrong. And the internal affairs process is more about a formality and less about accountability because we couldn't file this complaint until the trial was over. And it took 2 years for the trial to even start, which was also conveniently the deadline for filing this complaint. So, in other words, the police were able to delay the trial until it was too late for us to file. And this was a system by design. So when I look at that moment when I was just there by myself, literally my whole family is incarcerated, we have to acknowledge, first of all, we have to not live by the myth of colorblindness, or otherwise we'd be ignoring the reality that Black people across the country are having very different experiences with the criminal justice system than white people. That's the first thing. But I think the most important thing for me is to acknowledge that from plantation overseers to police officers, the past and present institutionalized supervision, scrutiny, and slaying of Black people is the cornerstone of this conversation, and really the root of the trauma, the distrust, and the division between our community and law enforcement. So time has changed, but the times have not. And I'll end my remarks there, and feel free to ask questions once we get into the conversation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. First of all, Rashawn, I had no idea you were going to make me come up here for 5 minutes. I thought I was going to be able to talk from my seat, but this is all right. So I want to start by telling a more personalized story about interactions with the police. And some of you may have heard this story. Some of you may have heard the myth of the story, but I'm going to give you a factual story that happened to me in 2007 on this campus. So I was scheduled to attend a panel in 2007. It was my first year here as assistant professor on the tenure track. And I was driving towards Mowat Garage. And there was a campus police officer who was driving literally on the tail of my car. And eventually when I pulled into Mowat Garage before I entered, he flashes his lights, pulls me over, and this is where it just all went awry. So we got into a very heated discussion about why he was pulling me over and the reasons why I still to this day don't understand. But I was eventually charged with failure to produce an identification and failure to produce and failure to obey a lawful order. I was summarily placed in a campus police car, handcuffed, which I thought I was being taken to the campus police. We got to Route 1. I thought we were going to make a left. We did not. We made a right. And I was summarily taken to Hyattsville to the detention center in Prince George's County, where I was placed in a jail cell. I had to take the cuffs out of my shirt, the shoelaces out of my shoes, and mind you, I had on a suit, and I was placed in a cell. And when I entered that cell, which was quite ironic, is that I'm from Philadelphia, and when I entered the cell, there was a guy that was already sitting in the cell, and he asked me where he was. He had no idea. He was like, where? I said, well, you're in a cell, right? But he had no idea that he was in Prince George's County. And he was from Philadelphia. And so we started a conversation, and he said he had been pulled over on the highway. The cops suspected that he had drugs. I don't know whether that was true or not. He had his children in the car, and his wife. He was separated from both his children and his wife. He had no idea where they were. And so while we were having this conversation, one of the police officers that were at the station opened the cell and literally asked me, he could not understand my charges, which I could not understand as well. And so I spent roughly 5 hours in that cell until I was taken to a bail commissioner. I was shackled around my waist, shackled around my ankles, and taken in a line, like in a slave chain gang. I was taken to a bail commissioner where I had to sit and defend why I should be able to get bail. And out of the 10 or 11 people that were arrested that we all went to that bail commissioner that day, I was the only one that was released on my own recognizance. I was placed back in another cell, and then I was eventually released. And I walked literally from Hyattsville to Nimburu Cultural Center. And it just happened to be for the grace of God that when I walked into Dr. Ziegler's office, and I don't know how many of you know him, there was an attorney in there that was a former prosecutor for Prince George's County. And I told him the story. And then he advised me to connect with a friend that he had who was a former prosecutor in Montgomery County. Long story short, I ended up paying $1,200. The case got to court and it was thrown out. But I can't begin to tell you how humiliated I was from that experience to this day. And so yesterday, I decided, to contextualize my work. It would be impossible for me as a scholar in the work that I do in urban communities to stay on Twitter and tweet out what's going on without going to Baltimore. So I left and went by myself yesterday at 4 o'clock. When I arrived, and I know, much props to DeRay, I'm glad he's here because he's been on the ground the entire time. But on Lexington Ave, I was in front of Lexington Market. There were a barrage of police officers there. It's very antagonistic. The majority of people that were there were very calm. There were a lot of kids outside. And really, I didn't see how what we saw on television and at the Model Mall, eventually that turned and spiraled out of control because I didn't see that. But I have to tell you, I left there, I traveled up Utah and made a left on North Avenue. And by the time I got on North, all I could see was smoke. And there weren't a lot of police out there at that time that were directing traffic. There were literally people living in that community that were waving people off and directing them to side streets in the community. So I come up one of the back blocks, I think it was Cumberland, and I saw a police van, and I wish at the time, my cell phone was going dead, but at the time I saw the police literally handing out batons to at least 20 officers that were all in riot gear. And this was in front of a neighborhood where the majority of people, no, they weren't out destroying property. They were sitting on their steps, being very civil. And so it made me think about it. Once I left and traveled back, I traveled past maybe about 7, 8 blocks of projects. And when I got to the end of the street, at the end of the 8 blocks, there was a concrete police barricade in the middle of a nondescript neighborhood with 30 police officers in riot gear. And I was like, why are police in this neighborhood at this time? And the only thing I could think of is clearly they're protecting or cordoning off those people who live in these projects, which then led to my own analysis of structural violence. And that's what I haven't been hearing in this entire discourse, is how the structure has been violent. The people that live in that neighborhood of Sandtown, Winchester, let me give you a fact. 458 people were incarcerated from that neighborhood last year. The state of Maryland spent $17 million incarcerating people from one neighborhood. They incarcerated more people in that neighborhood than they did in the entire Baltimore City. And if you do the math, divide 17 million by 458, that's $37,000 per person. It costs $24,000 a year in in-state tuition to attend this school. So you see where the resources are going? There are direct pipelines from many of these neighborhoods to the criminal justice system. And that just happens to be one of them. The same neighborhood which Freddie Gray lived in. So I'm not going to belabor the point of sitting here and giving you a bunch of statistics, but I can tell you what's going on out there is real. And many of it's a response to the oppression and structural violence that people have been experiencing for decades. There was a study done on many of the poor neighborhoods in Baltimore to document whether they were, to document the increase in poverty from 1970 to 2011, or whether those neighborhoods improved. In the majority of neighborhoods that they studied, the poverty rate has gone up. And that was 40 years ago. So not much has changed. And so while people are on the outside looking at the gentrification occurring in neighborhoods like Fells Point and Bolton Hill, there are people who are sitting on the outside of that, watching that go on, that will never get a slice of that pie. And for those warranted reasons, they should be angry. Now, I'm not condoning that they should set things on fire or destroy their neighborhoods, and I don't think many of them did, because the vast majority of people there weren't engaged in that kind of behavior. But we have to take into context how structural violence has affected neighborhoods throughout Baltimore City and neighborhoods throughout this country. And how are we going to remedy that? And how are we going to frame keeping people entrapped in concentrated poverty as violence? Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So, I thought I knew what I was going to talk about yesterday, and then I think maybe similarly to Kevin in his remarks this morning, things kind of rapidly changed for me over the course of the day. And they've been changing for me actually continually since I've been sitting in this room. So I have reflected on my own sort of intellectual pursuits and curiosities and how they may relate to what I do as an academic. I think I'm honored to be included in a conversation about intellectual activism. I'm honored to be included in this conversation. I hope that the contributions that I can make from within sort of my own constraints are helpful not only to me as an individual, but to my family of people who come and sit in this room and allow yourselves to be open to hearing the experiences of the people that we've just heard from, to hearing the experiences of the people whose stories you read on Twitter, to feeling the experiences of people whose stories you might just hear in passing and wonder, well, I wonder if that's just idiosyncratic. That's just one instance. Those of us as academics who think that's just one data point. Much of what I try to do with my own work is to contextualize these individual data points. It's not necessary for me to stand up here and intellectualize an individual's experience in order for it to somehow be relevant or in order for it to somehow actually be real. But what my work does allow me to do is to think about the connections among all of these individual experiences and to try to draw them together into some meaningful narrative that not only allows me to understand them as individuals, but allows me to understand how they interact with the broader society in which we live. Generally speaking, I know sort of in the introduction we talked about I study terrorism, study civil war. Generally speaking, I study mass mobilization, and particularly mass mobilization in the context of political dissent. I was a little bit confused about why I would be on a panel about criminalization until I thought really more deeply about specifically what it is that motivates me. What motivates me is not only the criminalization of individual people or of particular actions that individuals may take, but the criminalization of an entire system that's been designed to tamp down and to disincentivize protest, to disincentivize voice, and to disincentivize the communication of individual experiences in the context of those systems. Our systems don't exist without us. Our structures don't exist without our participation, and in some ways our complicity. I find it very difficult to condemn my brothers and sisters for their reaction to their experiences in the system within which we all live. I also find it very difficult to distance myself from that system and to say that as an academic, I study what other people do. I study how systems of white supremacy, how systems of capitalism, how systems of neoliberalism influence other people to do other things. Those systems influence me too.
I live here. I'm my own data point in many ways. That's what my intellectual activism means for me, is for actually understanding my own relationship to the things that I purport to study. And there's nothing that makes me better, or there's nothing that makes me more equipped or more erudite at understanding the experiences of my colleagues on this stage, the experiences that some of you may have had in this room, the experiences of people who watch, the experience of people who may only hear about this conference, the symposium, through Twitter or through secondhand knowledge. There's nothing unique about me. The only thing that is unique about me is my recognition of the minor privileges that I have the luxury to sit back and to think and not have to react immediately. It's a big privilege. And it's a privilege that gets overlooked far too often, I think, by my colleagues, often by me, by virtue of what I do and where I do it. One of the prompts that sort of Rishan gave us was to think about whether or not in the current moment we are experiencing or observing social movement. And I obviously, as an academic, right, I got into this business because I like to think, I'm curious. I like to have time to sit and think, ruminate, some people would say. And I thought about some of the definitions for social movement that we have. One thing that I hope that most people understand is that social movement is something that is not, again, arm's length. It's something that's engaged in by everyday people. It's something that we engage in every day. This current moment is characterized by a number of events that aggregate up into the longest sustained civil rights or civil resistance campaign that the United States has seen since the 1950s. This current moment is characterized by a confluence of grassroots action and mobilization that is engaged in by all of us in this room and others who couldn't make it because of that engagement. That mobilization is charged by a deep and profound discontent with the confluence of political, social, and economic structures that are in fact foundational to our society. When I talk about neoliberalism, when I talk about capitalism, when I talk about white supremacy as structures or as institutional manifestations of the society within which we live, that's real, that we can't divorce ourselves from that. And finally, the current moment is characterized by all of those things that combine to produce repeated and public displays of those of us who may be challenging the power holders or the manifestations of power in our current society through our numbers, through our commitment, through our unity, and through all of those as displays of our worthiness. One thing that social movements do fundamentally is sort of threefold, and that's to disrupt, that's to deprive power holders or those that would prioritize the status quo with the means of maintaining that, and for dismantling the systems that prioritize sort of the status quo and those that would defend it. That said, I believe in the power of individuals to do all three of those things, no matter how you do them, no matter when you do them, no matter who sees you do them. I believe in an individual's ability to do that, which by extension means I believe in myself and my own ability to do that through my work, through my words, through my actions, through things that nobody will ever know about, through my own care of myself and the process that I go through as an individual in not only understanding the system within which I live, but also the ways in which I interact with others as a result. So that said, why am I involved in issues related to race and social justice? Because I'm an individual in the world that would like justice. I'm social. I interact with those in the system around me. And race is a fundamental and very meaningful dimension of my own personal identity. And so to the extent that I've gotten one of those jobs that's never a job, right? When you take a job, if you're doing what you love, then you'll never work a day in your life. Well, I'm not working a day in my life because I'm better understanding myself through the work that I do. Hopefully that process will help me to help others understand themselves and the work that they may do. And so that's my deal. Thanks.
afternoon, y'all. It's really good to be here. I think all of us are probably feeling all sorts of emotion right now. Over the last few days, I've just found myself in various emotional states. But I'm actually really glad to be here. I was contemplating doing a number of things and not showing up and stuff. But I'm just being honest, for right reasons, right? I'm an organizer, so and I'm working on a campaign in New York, so there are things to be done. But I, at the core of me, believe that these kinds of gatherings matter. That people like you, people of conscience, matter. And that you being engaged and equipped with the right information and the tools and engaged in your community will make the difference. And so I'm here to contribute to that conversation. I'm going to be brief because I think you said 2 or 3 minutes. But I want to just share that, my name is Opal. I am a co-founder of Black Lives Matter. To be clear, it is much more than a hashtag. I think you all have engaged in it in some degree. But we are a national and even international network with about 25 chapters all across the country and a few in different parts of the world. And I just want to share that information because, as the sister was sharing, there is a movement that is burgeoning, that is in effect. And there are a number of other grassroots organizations across the country who are also engaged in this movement. And as was mentioned in my bio, I'm also the director of an organization called the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. We're about 9 years old. We were founded in Oakland, California, and we're the only Black-led immigrant rights organization across the country. And we work with, as was shared, African Americans and Afro-Latinos and Caribbean immigrants, African immigrants. And fundamentally, we believe that some of the root challenges that we face is actually what's leading to the criminalization of our people, the displacement of our people within the US, but also abroad. So the crisis is actually a global crisis of anti-Black racism. It's pervasive. And the neoliberal agenda is actually what's giving it so much fuel these days. So I just want to put that out there. I think there's going to be a lot more opportunity to get into some deeper discussion as to what that actually means and what that looks like. But I want to share a couple of things. One, I think it's clear that in this day and age, in the era of mass criminalization, which is what I think this particular panel has been called to speak to, in the era of mass criminalization, an indictment will not guarantee justice, right? I think we can say that very clearly. In the era of mass criminalization, a guilty verdict does not equate with justice. We will not find justice in our court systems or through the DOJ or any of our other traditional mechanisms. We can try, I think we should fight, we should do some of those things, but let's be clear, that's not going to be the entirety of what justice looks like for Black people or for any person in the United States when we are feeling the effects of state violence wholesale on all our people. I just want to just share that so we're all clear. And I want to read a statement from Baltimore United for Change. I think it's really important as a community organizer to really uplift the voices of folks at the grassroots, folks who are directly affected. What their demands are our collective demands. I think we have to follow their lead. And so being that we're here, I think it's really important that I amplify those voices and their message. And it's short, so it's not too long. And it says this. So this is from Baltimore United for Change, and this is a broad coalition of community groups. And they released this statement, I think, late last night. So, it has been 15 days since Freddie Gray was stuffed into a Baltimore Police Department van, and no officer, elected official, or agency has taken any responsibility for his subsequent death or the policies that allow it to stand. Therefore, we continue to witness the further erosion of the already broken relationship between Black communities and law enforcement. The truth is that our region's elected officials have not seen it as a politically useful to act on the long-standing issues of police violence in Black communities. What we are witnessing today is the crossing of a tipping point by communities that have remained unheard for far too long. The Baltimore Police Department is employing aggressive and heavy-handed tactics on Black youth who have not accepted the platitudes or spin being offered from our region's leaders. The same Baltimore Police Department skirting responsibility for the death of Freddie Gray is now trying to sell our city a narrative where gangs have issued a unified threat, quote unquote, against police officers. Now, the New York Police Department tried that tactic in December, and it remains unproven. What we have seen is an unprecedented truce between rival gangs, which is in the best interest of our communities. For us, the greatest threat is from law enforcement. Stoking the flames of fear won't get our city out of this. More explanations about what isn't possible will not get our city out of this. Increasing militarized crackdowns will only serve to further diminish Baltimore's hope of meeting the challenge or eradicating police violence. Our region's leaders must take decisive action to end Baltimore's dangerous addiction to broken law enforcement policies that ruin our communities, tear apart our families, and cost lives. Baltimore United for Change is a broad coalition seeking justice for Freddie Gray and an end to police violence. And some of the members of this coalition include the Baltimore Algebra Project, Baltimore Block, Casa de Maryland, City Block, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Tyrone West Coalition, Kinetics, and then there are many, many others who are part of this coalition. And I'll stop there, but I just wanted you all to hear directly from folks on the ground, and I'm sure DeRay is going to be able to speak a lot more to that, but I think it's really important that we uplift the voices and the words and the demands of our brothers and sisters on the ground, and amplify that. And their analysis is spot on. And so I'm just grateful because I think we're living in a time period where people are not shying away from calling for the justice that we need, and they're not shying away from addressing root causes. And I think we're fundamentally in a different period of time where all of us, from what I'm understanding, is we're bringing our full selves. So myself, as a daughter of Nigerian immigrants, a Black woman in the United States, talking fully about who I am, who I love, and fighting for all of who I am and all of who my community is, and not throwing anybody under the bus. And so when we say Black Lives Matter, we mean that all Black lives matter. Trans lives matter, right? Trans Black folk, queer Black folk. Black immigrants matter, right? So all of us matter. Differently abled matter. So I'll just end there, and I look forward to this conversation around criminalization and equality and justice. Thank you.
Thank you. We also wanted to introduce real quickly and have him come up and give a couple of minutes to address you, Mr. DeRay McKesson. Mr. McKesson is the Senior Director of Human Capital with Minneapolis Public Schools and is a Teach for America alum, having taught 6th grade math in New York City. He has been documenting the events of Ferguson via Twitter at DeRay, and is the founder and co-editor of the Ferguson Protester newsletter, This Is the Movement. He is an activist, organizer, and educator focusing primarily on issues impacting children, youth, and families. He previously worked for the Harlem Children's Zone and TNTP, where he opened an academic enrichment center in West Baltimore and with Baltimore Public Schools in leading systemic human capital change. He was recently named one of the world's greatest leaders in Fortune magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for DeRay McKesson.
Hey everybody, so I am, it's always humbling to be in spaces where we talk about the movement. I remember in August when we were literally like fighting for our lives, and we never thought that the movement would live this long, right? Like today's the 263rd day of protest across the country, and it is always humbling to be in these spaces. If any of you follow me on Twitter, there's nothing new that I can say, so you've already heard it, so I'll just say that. You know, I'm gonna say a couple extended things because I'm gonna get right back on the road. As you probably know, there's unrest in Baltimore right now. I do not call it riots. I don't think America has seen riots, but definitely has seen unrest. And I'll cover 4 big buckets. So in the other prefaces, I came today both because I said I was gonna come, and I'm like trying to stay true to my word. And also, so I'm here so I don't get fined, right? I'm here so I don't get fined. And also because, you know, and I struggle with panels and stuff because often I think that the revolution is just not in this room, right? It's just not on panels, it's not sitting in conference spaces, but I do believe that the revolution can start here, right? They're like, I know you. Hey, that's so funny. We went to Bowdoin together. And Tony, I love it. It's a small world. Okay, let me focus. So, but I'm here again because I think that like the revolution starts somewhere, that it can start in these places, and I hope that you can be pushed by the things that people say today to figure out like where you stand in the struggle and how close you're willing to stand. So I'll talk about 4 things. One is this issue of proximity. So there's always a question of how close are you willing to stand to the work? Sometimes I think that we misunderstand proximity as this question of how close are you willing to stand to the trauma. And the reality of black people is that we always close to the trauma, right? Marginalized people always stand. It's always a question of fear. It's always this question of proximity to fear and trauma. But the question is how close will you stand to the work? When I think about my own story, Mike got killed on the 9th of August, 2014. I was on my couch on August 16th. I saw it on Twitter. I was like, this looks crazy. I got in a car, drove 9 hours to St. Louis, didn't know anybody, put on Facebook that I was going. Some friends like connected me with somebody else. They put me somewhere I could stay for 2 days, and then I just like never went home, right? Like I stayed, I flew back and forth, like that was my story. And there was a question for me of like, I'm willing to stand really close, right? Like I wanted to be close to the work, and the work for me was initially this bearing witness. I went to sort of tell a story. That's why I tweeted so much. I had about 900 followers in August. I have 90,000 now. And in the beginning, I had no friends in Missouri at all, right? Nobody. I didn't know anybody. So when I was experiencing the police be crazy, like I couldn't tell anybody. I wasn't standing with anybody. All I could do was tweet. And that was like my story. And that was me standing close, was bearing witness. But this issue of proximity is important because when we think about your ability to do the work in social justice, if you are not close to the work, I don't think you can do it. So there's some people who stand really far away and they're like, oh, but I care, and it's like, I don't know what that means. And I'll talk about what it means to be an ally soon. But the question that I would pose to you is like, how close are you willing to stand to the work? And will you check yourself when you feign proximity? So there are people who say, you know, I'm in the struggle, I get it, and you're like, well, what part of the struggle are you in? And the struggle doesn't have to be on the street, right? There are many ways to protest. If we understand protest as confrontation and disruption, there are many ways to confront a corrupt system. There are many ways to disrupt a corrupt system. And like, where will you be in the work is really important. And then it's the question with proximity of, are you willing to stand if you stand alone? I think about there were so many nights that you didn't see on the news when it was cold outside, there's nobody out there, we sleeping in the car. Right? I remember one time I rented this van, we were all knocked out. It's like 3 o'clock in the morning, everybody's sleeping in the van. And like those were the nights when we were like out there alone, right? There were small groups of people out there night after night. And it was this fight of like, we believe what is happening is so wrong that we will stay and fight even if we stand alone. The second thing I'll talk about is storytelling, and I love this part of storytelling, partly because it's what I do so much on Twitter. But what Twitter allowed us to do is tell our oone stories. As marginalized people, what happens so often is that our stories are either erased or they are told by everybody but us. And what we got to do this time was we got to tell it. And not only could I tell it, me, you, everybody, we could tell the same story at once. Like we could reclaim the narrative in real time, which is so powerful. I think about the ways that we've started to tell the story about Baltimore, right? Like, I will not call it a riot. I can't do hashtag Baltimore riots. I can only talk about an uprising. What I saw was an uprising. And if you want to talk about violence, me too. The police have been killing people since August and before that, right? They've been violent, right? So, you know, and like I said today, I was on this thing on CNN, and it's like, you know what, broken windows, they'll be back, but Freddie won't, right? And broken windows aren't broken spines. And my push to you is like, we need to continue to reframe this conversation that we're in, because we lose it so often. We accept this narrative. So the Baltimore police said there was a credible threat of gang violence. And I'm saying that the gangs I know, and I'm not a gang expert, so please don't tweet DeRay know the gangs. But, you know, they aren't sending out press releases. So I don't know, like, what was the credible threat? And then we see yesterday, it was high school. I was there. High school students were throwing rocks, right? They were upset. They weren't in gangs. So it's this, again, it's this narrative that is happening across the country, and most recently in Baltimore, of like the violent protesters. And again, what I would say is that violence is people being hurt, and what I saw and what I continue to see is property damage. And I don't have to condone it to understand it, right? But I get that people grieve differently, and I will never condemn the way my people mourn. There's also something about, when I think about our two goals that we have in this space, me and Netta being my partner, one is to tell the truth differently, right? How do we tell the truth differently? And then how do we tell the truth in ways that empower people? And telling the truth differently is this issue of, you know, when we think about Baltimore, the police in Baltimore kill more people than 93 of the biggest 100 cities in America, right? Which is a different way to tell the truth. It has always been true, but we're telling it differently. And then telling the truth in ways that empower people is creating tools that people can use in their own spaces. The other thing I'll say about storytelling is about the origin story of the protests, right? Is what is so powerful to me is that when I think about how the movement began, it began with like regular people coming out of their houses and saying no more. It wasn't a committee, it wasn't a small group, it wasn't a big group, it wasn't a conference call, it wasn't a meeting, it was people who said no more. And I think that origin story is actually more powerful than anything else that has come out of the protests, because what it shows you is that you are enough to start a movement, right? That like it wasn't a Martin, it wasn't a Malcolm, it wasn't the NAACP or SNCC, it was people who came outside and said no more. And that is what happened in the streets of Baltimore. It was people out there. It wasn't the pastors were there, they were. The Nation of Islam, they were there, but when I tell you it was more of the unaffiliated than anybody else out in the streets, right? And like that matters, because when I think about the story I was told about the civil rights movement, it was not one of regular people coming outside. It was one of organizations sort of corralling people in schools and churches, and that's not where we are now. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that has happened in protest that is important. I will always push on this narrative of the origin story of the movement being the people. So if you want to put somebody on any magazine cover, put everybody in Ferguson who came outside night after night, right? Because that is the story of Ferguson. The last thing I'll say about, and again, I'm a little longer because I'm literally leaving after this, but the last thing I'll say about this story, two things are, one is like, are you gonna actually hold people accountable for telling the true story about communities that look like you, right? So I've been in places where people say thugs, people say disparaging things about black people or people of color, and people let them off the hook. And if you allow that to happen, you're not standing close to the work, right? When I think about people in schools and stuff, you know, I talk to teachers, and it's like, you let people call your kids hoodlums, right? Like, you let them talk about their families in ways that are really negative. And if you allow that storytelling to happen like that, like, you are doing a disservice to the people you claim to stand with. And the last thing is this thing about reading that I'll use here, just because I always think it's interesting. It was interesting for me when I thought of it. Does anybody know Bomani Jones? He's a sports guy. So Bomani is interesting. He's a friend of the movement. We talked on the phone, and he sounds just like he does on TV. He's like, "Hello, DeRay, good to meet you." You're like, "Why do you sound like that?" But we're talking about like how to reframe this narrative, and what I said to him is, you know, I said to him, Bomani, I'm a third generation reader, right? That like only 3 generations of my family have ever read. And that like I'm probably a second generation like someone who can comprehend, like not a fluent reader, right? Like fluency is the ability to look at words and repeat them back. Comprehension is the ability to understand text. So I'd like for you to raise your hand if you are a third generation reader. If you are, okay, put them down. If you're a 4th generation reader, raise your hand. Second generation readers? Raise them high. First generation readers. And the reason I do this is, one, to reframe this conversation about like reading for people, but also to talk about intergenerational trauma. Like the reason that people are in the streets is definitely because of the police, right? Like I'm somebody who put my body and life on the line night after night because the police are killing people, and that's just not okay. But there's also this deeper conversation about the trauma that people of color and marginalized people have always faced in this country. And reading's a really interesting example. Like, what does it mean that like you can trace back, you can touch the people who've read in your family? That's a crazy way to think about trauma. And I say that because this is this part about like, how do you tell the truth differently to people? You know, I'll talk about protests for 1 second and then allies. So protest, the reason we protest is not to affirm the worth of our lives, but to expose the depth of the evil we face, right? We know we matter. Black Lives Matter is not about saying to each other that we are important, we know it. It's about confronting a system with that message and seeing the system respond in ways that don't affirm that, right? And the reason that people stay on the street is that we believe that any wins that we get without pressure will lead to scale backs. So you know what? You mad that we in the street? You mad that you can't go home? We mad too, right? We all mad. Everybody mad out there, right? And that's real. And that's important to us. It is about spreading the pain. It's about people who want to commodify and partake in every part of blackness but the struggle. And protest is giving a struggle for free, right? It's all yours. And the last thing is about allies, and I see a lot of white people in the room, so I'm talking to you, and I'm not just talking to you, but I am talking to people who consider themselves an ally to any part of the struggle, right? So like, if they're queer allies, or straight allies, or trans allies, whatever part of the ally world you're in, the message is that your presence is not enough, right? Like, you don't get to invite yourself into spaces and call yourself an ally. Allyship is either earned or invited, right? So there are people who come to spaces and they think that like showing up is the movement. And you're like, that's not what it means. Because allyship is about standing with me in struggle, right? It's about proximity. Allies, there's a question of proximity. And you can only stand with me truly if I ask you to, or I accept you standing with me. Advocates, you can stand wherever you want. I can advocate for people in India all day long, and I'm not there, not going there, right? But I can be an advocate from afar, and people can do that work. But being an ally is about proximity, is about standing close to people. So if you find yourself wanting to be in struggle with people, ask them what they want. When I think about white people often, and this, you know, I'm not like, Lord knows it'll be DeRay hates white people. I don't hate white people. But I do think there's this issue of like people who are always expected to be heard, right? So I know a lot of white people who they sit in spaces where they always are heard. And that is like a condition of privilege. And what happens in marginalized spaces is that you become a leader because you've always led. You've always been in places where your voice has always mattered. And like what white people have to do is like not take over marginalized spaces, right? Like what you need to do is use your privilege in ways that actually amplify the work and the message of marginalized people. Because the reality is that you have a privilege we will never have, right? And we shouldn't, right? Because there's this thing of if we actually do this work well, you will have less power today than you ever have, right? Like you will be relinquishing your privilege if we get to equity. So if we win, we should not experience any type of privilege based on race because nobody should. But if you actually stand in the struggle with people, you are going to use that privilege you have now to actually deconstruct that privilege. And if you don't accept that as your work, then you are not in the work that we are in, right? And that's a real part of this. So I know I was long. I'm going to go. I will say that, you know, there is this idea that like love is the why. Like we are angry, we are hurt, and we are mourning, but that is not enough to sustain a movement. Love is. Like people are in the street because they love Dontre and Martise and Ayana and Rakia and Freddie and Mike enough to say no more.
So everyone should have a note card on their seat or close to them. You can write down questions on that. A panelist will respond to those. We will also be responding to questions on Twitter. So get your note card, and if you don't have one, write it on a scratch sheet of paper. We will collect those and bring those up to Delegate Washington.
Thank you. So we do have a couple of questions, but before that, before I start getting beat up here, being the only legislator for the state up here, let me just mention a couple of things that we passed this year in relation to criminalization and law enforcement. So recently we passed a bill called the Maryland Second Chance Act. which would shield certain criminal records or misdemeanors from employment, so that a lot of our folks who have offended recently or in the past are able to get adequate employment. We also repealed the repeal of mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes. That was a big deal that we passed in this past Maryland General Assembly. We increased reporting for race-based traffic stops. As you know, African Americans are pulled over at a higher rate than our white counterparts. We also required reporting on all civilian deaths and police encounters. There's nowhere in the country where there's mandatory, a comprehensive, full mandatory reporting of when someone dies in the hands of police. That was actually my bill that I passed recently out of the House of Delegates and into the Senate, and the governor was supposed to sign it today, but due to the unrest that's occurring in Baltimore, he decided to reschedule our signing ceremony. I'm also about to tweet out to you all a list of bills that we passed in relation to criminal justice reform and law enforcement. So I'm tweeting that right now with the hashtag Parren15. So to get into this discussion, I'm gonna ask the panel the first question that came up, which is, how should people react when they are unlawfully stopped by police? What are their rights? Anyone? Don't make me choose.
I'll just say something really quick. I'm by no means a legal scholar, so don't take this as sort of legal advice. But what I would say is that it's incredibly important for folks to educate themselves about sort of particularly the local circumstances in which they find themselves. So while I don't know what the answer is, so how should you react if you've been detained or if you're in the process of being arrested, or even just find yourself sort of in the company of a law enforcement officer, what I will say is you should have some idea of sort of what the police codes are in your local jurisdiction. You should go to the ACLU website or to other websites where there is information about how to protect your own legal rights. I think there are a lot of resources out there. Maybe my broader answer to this is educate yourselves. Don't wait for people to tell you exactly what you should do. Ask questions if you don't know where to find the information, and hopefully you'll find a kindred soul who can help you find it. But you should not go into any situation blind, and particularly not an adversarial situation. You should always be armed with the knowledge of your surroundings, and in some ways the knowledge of sort of the preferences of the people that you may be relating to. I know what the penal code is in DC because I live in DC. I understand sort of what police officers need to do to disperse a crowd in DC, because if I ever find myself in a crowd in DC, I'm going to need to know to what extent my rights are being violated and or respected or protected, however you want to think about it. So rather than sort of telling people exactly what to do, that maybe is my advice, even though you weren't asking for advice.
No, that was perfect. Thank you. Dr. Richardson?
I would add that William Murphy, who is now the lead attorney in the Freddie Gray situation, has created a really powerful documentary. It's called Know Your Rights, and actually we show that documentary every year to all the black male students that are at this university that participate in our Black Male Initiative program. So I would suggest if you really want something that's very short and brief, and he's an amazing defense attorney, that you can pull it up on YouTube. It's roughly 30 minutes. It's called Know Your Rights. It's by William Murphy. But the other thing I would suggest, as someone that's been pulled over numerous times, is that the number one thing that you need to do is stay calm. Because if there's anything that an officer is looking for more, is that it's the irateness to take something that becomes a very simple stop into a situation that spiraled out of control, that you may have lit the torch in leading to something that you'll go down a long road of legalities and getting involved in a court system that you don't really want. So I would suggest the first thing that you need to do is just maintain your cool. Because the one thing that you want to do is you want to be able to live another day, A, to be able to fight it in court. And that won't happen. Because in most of these cases that we see, whether it's Tamir Rice or Freddie Gray, without having videotape, that person is not here to defend themselves. And so one of the things that you really want to make sure you do is that you stay alive and stay calm enough to be able to have your day in court, because justice ultimately will serve if the universe of karma is correct.
I had to disagree with that last bit, but I appreciate where you were going with it originally. People get killed, right? Regardless, I think there's no guaranteed way for protecting yourself. Like this notion of like pulling your pants up or like walking a particular way or all this, you know, that's not actually going to save you. However, I do think you do need to do your due diligence, know your rights. There are different things that you can do, but it's not actually going to save us at the end of the day. I think only organizing in a system or against a system that systematically devalues Black life, brown life, all of our lives in one way or fashion or form, is ultimately the only way to protect yourself. And so I would encourage ourselves to look a little bit deeper. And the other thing is I would encourage, you know, women and girls to also know their rights, because women and girls are also murdered too.
Thank you. Now, since this discussion is centered around mass incarceration, of course we all know Michelle Alexander recently wrote a book about the new Jim Crow, and that mass incarceration is about the new Jim Crow. In the state of Maryland, African Americans make up 30% of the population, but make up 70% of the prison population, while whites make up 55% of the population, but only make up 27% of the prison population. How do we begin to rectify the racial disparities in our prison system?
Okay, so I think, thank you for raising that point. When we're in this era of mass incarceration and mass criminalization, and when we think about like how to really address the racial disparity. Now, I work a lot on these issues, like working with policymakers and speaking with their staff about, hey, what do we do about the racial disparity? And I think for me personally, I think the first thing that we have to really be mindful of is like how we name this problem, because I've heard it be called racial disparity, disproportionate impact, discrimination, and to me these are euphemisms for saying racism. And our policymakers are so uncomfortable with the term racism, everybody's afraid of being called a racist, so we can't really have an honest conversation about racism in the country. So that's like a big problem, and like that's kind of why we're where we are today, because nobody wants to acknowledge a system that has been built by white supremacy in the interest of white supremacy that has first dehumanized Black people through commodification and now through criminalization and mass incarceration. So until we can really have an honest conversation with our policymakers about racism and how it's not discrimination, they're two different things, and I think that will be a huge hurdle for us to get over, to really looking at the root and the system that is allowing this to play out the way that we see it.
Is it kind of about cops and stuff? You can just talk about it.
Okay.
One of the issues is clearly we have to get at those policies that have been on the books for so long, that have pulled so many people into the criminal justice system. So particularly the draconian drug laws that we have that have pulled in numerous people into criminal justice system that they can't get out of. But also we need to be, very cognizant about how we organize on a grassroots level about all of these issues. And I think it's very important that we organize on a grassroots level and that we begin to work with legislators such as yourself that can advocate for those policies. Because one of the things which I thought that you brought up, which was really interesting, is that besides the work that was discussed, I work in the trauma unit in Prince George's Hospital Trauma Center. And I'm the director of an emerging hospital-based violence intervention program. And what we do is I work with young people that have been shot. Prince George's Hospital, we're the largest and busiest level trauma 1 in the nation. We see 700 people a year that have been victims of violent injury. And so I know firsthand what leads to young people being injured. I work with them every day. And so one of the things that has come out of the work that we've been doing is we've found that many of the young men that we work with who are under probation or parole are now shifting over to smoking synthetic marijuana because they don't want to get popped for a dirty urine on their urinalysis. But what's interesting about that is that the way we found out about that is that the majority of young men that we work with are under some form of criminal justice supervision. And that's how it came up. And so when the laws changed with the decriminalization of marijuana, one of the things that did not change was that people who are on probation and parole are still being tested for THC. And so despite the laws that exist in society that we can now smoke marijuana, we can have an ounce on us and we only get a fine, that doesn't count for those people who are still under criminal justice supervision. They still have to deal with being tested, despite the fact that the majority of people out here do not have to go under those strict conditions of probation and parole. And one of the things that lands the majority of people back into prison are technical parole and probation violations, which is why you see in a situation where you have young men jumping out of the car and running from police because they're afraid of child support, and that's a totally another issue, and we could talk about that ad nauseum. But we need to make sure that the laws that we have in society are reflective too with the population that was often unjustly brought into the criminal justice system. And I just want to make one more point. It's interesting that, so I'm a TV watcher, so late night, I don't know how many of you have ever watched the show Lock Up. But what's interesting about the parallels of that show is that I was watching maybe 2 weeks ago, and there was a show called Pop Barons of Colorado. And it's funny to see the sensationalism that is occurring with this newfound capitalistic get rich off selling marijuana, and the majority of people in that show are white men. And then you watch that for an hour, and then you shift over to Lock Up, and the entire show is about poor people of color, particularly black and brown men, who are incarcerated, and you know that 50% of those incarcerated are arrested for marijuana, who are all in jail for marijuana charges. Something is fundamentally wrong about that. And that's something that we even need to question, is that how have we had a system now where people are getting richer from the sale of marijuana, but the majority of people who have been captured and victims in the war on drugs will hold that felony for the rest of their lives, which will disenfranchise them from everything. So another thing that we need to focus on too are the felony disenfranchisement laws, and we can get into that as we talk further in this discussion. Thank you.
We also, the Maryland, I just want to let you know, just for FYI purposes, so I'm going to do a lot of FYI, not defensive things, but I'm going to say FYI. We did pass a law recently that would give ex-felons the ability to vote here in the state of Maryland. So that was passed by the General Assembly this last session. I did want to go on about, because I didn't hear anything about mentoring, intervention, reentry, great reentry programs, things of those nature about mass incarceration. But just going down, I want to hit some of these questions from a lot of our folks on Twitter, a lot of folks everywhere, so I'm going to skip that. So emotional warfare and the psychological damage of victims and protesters are not being addressed by the media. Do you have any suggestions of why this isn't being addressed by the media?
I think it's not being addressed by media because it doesn't fit the narrative, right? The narrative is of protesters that are somehow irrational, of sort of the expression of discontent or of out-and-out dissent as somehow dangerous or not well thought out, unorganized, unprincipled. If you want to use some of the imagery that's already in the media, savage. I think that to recognize that the people that we see on the TV screen are people who are hurting and are people who are looking for some resolution to the pain, as well as to the frustration and to the anger and to every other emotion that comes along with sort of being oppressed. And living in a system that is built to perpetuate the oppression requires you to recognize that those people are people like you who are watching. There's no fundamental difference between the folks that are out there expressing these sentiments and you who are not, either because you don't identify or because there's some other way that you feel like you need to express that for yourself. That's my personal opinion on it, that there is a very real narrative that's constructed around protest and dissent, particularly in this country, particularly with respect to oppressed peoples, marginalized peoples, disenfranchised peoples, however you want to characterize it.
I'll just add, so I really appreciate that. So in the media, perhaps it's not being framed that way, right? But in our communities, we're organizing for our own care. We're engaged in practices that are about self-care and are about community care. And so actually when we say Black Lives Matter, it's both an internal dialogue that we're having with Black people, but it's also an external demand and an external conversation that we're having with non-Black people. And the internal conversation that we're having with our people is like, I love you. There's a profound sense of Black love that is emanating, I think, in many of our organizing spaces right now. And I think about New York City and the Black Lives Matter chapter that's there, and the prioritization of having a healing component in all of the meetings, practices that affirm our own inherent human dignity as part of our own process for healing. And then we move into the organizing pieces. So I just want to share that because it's not necessarily framed or out there in the press, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. And I think it's really important that as we go out and we continue to share about the work of resistance that is going on, we also speak about the resilience and the resilience practices of our communities, because those of us who are deliberate and are engaging in community organizing across the country, I think have been really pressed with this question. We're dealing with a great degree of trauma, and we see people manifesting it in so many ways, and even myself and many others in the movement dealing with a lot of chronic health issues. And I think we're at a unique period of time where we're saying, all right, enough. We actually have to have time to do this work in a way that's sustainable, in a way that allows for us to, and Brittany kind of shared it earlier, but your individual life matters. I remember I was speaking with somebody who's like a coach to me and a mentor to me, and she says, slow down, Opal, like you need to do this work in a sustainable way, and your Black life actually matters. So yeah, maybe you're one of the co-founders of BLM, but you actually, like your individual life needs to matter as you're doing this like broader Black Lives Matter work. And so I think we all should know and should make it a priority to take care of yourself, but also create a sense and a set of practices and mechanisms for accountability that allow for you to stay in the work, allow you to stay alive. Our lives are cut short for a variety of different reasons, and oftentimes it's due to the stress and the trauma, and our bodies are acting out of that as well. And I'll share one quick example of how some of me and my girlfriends are engaging in self-care. We've created like a pool of money, a pot of money that we put into each month, like a small amount of money, but then we rotate who receives that money, and it's like a self-care pot. And it's our way of saying, like, I actually need you to survive. I need you to thrive. You deserve that. I love you. And so I'm invested to the point that I'm going to give and sacrifice a little bit of money to ensure that you make it the next day. And so I think those stories aren't being shared as much, and I think it's actually really important that we do. So I appreciate you, offering that framing.
No, just following up on that, there's been a lot of questions about just notification of some of these other incidents that occurred recently. such as, here's a question that says, why did Gray's murder lead to uprising, but no one cared when Baltimore cops killed Maya 2 weeks ago? I believe Maya was a transgender individual, and no one really had any, there wasn't an uprising for that. Why is that the case? Why doesn't this matter? How come this isn't being portrayed on the media? How come this isn't being talked about in our conversations? Opal, I'm gonna ask you to answer that, if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'll answer whatever. I think this has to also do with the narrative and the ways in which our society pivots around violence against Black men. There is a particular, we're living in the United States of America, right? White supremacy and patriarchy are the way of the day. And so there's a particular ease to which we are easily able to orient ourselves around violence against Black men. Completely understandable and abhorrent, and we should rise up and always, whenever anybody is murdered unjustly or a period, I think that there should be a public outcry. However, there is a profound silence around the murder of Black women, cis women, trans women, cis girls, trans girls. And I think we actually have to challenge our communities to do the work, to rise up. I know that in New York City, folks tried to organize a rally for Rekia Boyd just this past week, and we had a really difficult time getting people to show up. And I know that's the case across the country. It's not just in New York, it's not just in Chicago, it's not even just here. It's something that is actually occurring all across the United States. And I think that there's a particular narrative that is so strong within our discourse and the way even the media pays attention to whose lives matter and who gets covered and whose stories get told, that allow for the community to rise up in a particular way. And I think it's doing us a disservice.
Oh, specifically, how can someone in this room, if we're not the media, how can we make situations like this, like the transgender woman that was recently murdered by the police officers, how can we make that an issue and make it larger using Twitter and using hashtags? I mean, how can we make that how can we increase the awareness of those situations?
I think what we can do is prioritize that. I think we make a commitment to intentionally prioritize those who are most marginalized in our community and bring their concerns to the center. I think ultimately without principled action, we aren't gonna get there. We'll continue to kind of like go with the mainstream, this is what matters and this is what we should be concerned about, this is what we should be in the streets about. However, what we've done within Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter being started by 2 queer women, being started by a Nigerian woman, we actually have a particular reading on these situations that is different than what's even being covered oftentimes. And for us, what we've done is we've prioritized Black trans leadership even within our own national coordinating committee. Many folks don't realize that, but we've actually prioritized even fundraising for Black trans organizing. And this is our politic, and these are our principles, and we put them into practice. Mm-hmm. And until people put their theories and their goodwill and so on into action and into practice, we'll continue to miss the boat. And I think we'll continue to not show up for Black trans lives. And so I would encourage all of us to put our good thinking and our goodwill into action and principally show up for Black trans lives, to show up for Black women's lives.
Got it. Now, Dr. Bond, you spoke a little bit earlier about that there's a disincentivized voice and protest that happens among the government or whatever have you. I think that's kind of what you said. I'm summarizing, but we have a question here that also speaks to what you said. Was kind of like, what about those creating unrest who have destroyed property, endangered fellow Black lives, police lives, etc.? How can that be justifiable? How, in the name of equality, in the name of justice, They are the few, but they are ignorant, and the media's cover of it has pretty much defined the movement. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think at first I respond by saying that whatever emotion or whatever sentiment I may have felt that compelled me to participate in any sort of action of dissent is justifiable. What drove me to dissent is always justifiable because it's a result of my experience with the system that I live in and with the constraints that I'm confronted with. I think that, and I may be wrong, and maybe this person is here and they can correct me about the context, but I don't think that it's a good idea to think about sort of ranking the ways in which you can confront a system, or the ways in which you can dissent, or the ways in which you can express discomfort or dissatisfaction on sort of a rank of acceptable to unacceptable, because that's actually not my standard necessarily. There's a standard for confronting the system that is set by the system. And so my take on things is often when we're placed in this situation where we have to say, well, this was the right way to do it and this was the wrong way to do it, the metric for understanding right and wrong is not necessarily a metric that's reflecting either effectiveness at changing the system that it's meant to confront, or effectiveness at resolving whatever the impetus was individually for participating. I think maybe I'll echo what DeRay said earlier. I can understand something without condoning it. I can understand something without necessarily identifying with it. And I can recognize the value in the underlying impetus in a way that abstracts it from the actual manifestation, right? So let me be really clear about this.
Thank you.
Property damage is property damage, okay? Property damage is property damage. Murder is murder. Stealing is stealing. Disenfranchising is disenfranchising. Stealing is stealing no matter what you're stealing. If you're stealing opportunities, is that more or less meaningful than stealing goods? I don't know, I can't say. They were my goods that were stolen. Maybe I feel a certain way about my opportunities. Maybe I place a different value on property or on things than other people might. So maybe this is my way around saying, I'm not gonna always say that violence is not the answer. I'm not always going to say that violence is wrong. I'm not always going to say that property damage equals violence. What I am going to say is that I am more interested in whatever the impetus was for the action than the action itself.
Okay, so moving on, just into that, just going back to mass incarceration, the city council member from Baltimore City, Councilmember Mosby, on Fox News recently stated that the reason a lot of this unrest is occurring is because of the oppression that has occurred in there in Baltimore for over years, and the lack of opportunities economically and socially that are there in Baltimore City. Right now, Maryland's youth employment is at 13%, is even higher for at-risk youth. How does the lack of opportunities for our youth affect the rates of mass incarceration? Dr. Richardson, can you speak to that for me?
I wouldn't necessarily even say that it's the lack of opportunities that have increased the rates of mass incarceration, because you really have to be honest about how young black children are criminalized. And the pre-K to prison pipeline is very real. I mean, the zero tolerance policy, there was recently a study published that said, black children are more likely to be perceived as less innocent, more likely to be suspended, particularly black girls, in grade school than white children. So if we think about the policies that have, on just the ground level from K through 12, that have contributed to so many young black people being placed in the criminal justice system, which serves as almost a pipeline to the prison industrial complex, we can clearly understand it. And so with the lack of opportunities that we have in these neighborhoods, and again, I go back to this concept of structural violence, and I'm going to keep pushing it. No one has contextualized the violence that occurs when children are just pushed from K through 12, through the juvenile justice system, into adult court, and the majority of young people that are in adult court are African American. So when we're criminalizing young black bodies from a very early age and showing that we don't really value them, that's the criminalization in itself. Is that not violence? Will we not call that violence? Will we not call keeping people oppressed in concentrated poverty for generations violence? It is. So, and I just want to get to another point, and I think you brought it up earlier, and I did not address it. So one of the things that, and it's getting to this issue of violence as well. One of the issues that I'm really concerned about is the fact that the FBI has no database, none, on how many people are shot by the police every year. And what's interesting about that is, since I work in a hospital in a trauma unit, I can't tell you the amount of times that there's a young black person lying in that hospital bed, handcuffed to a bed with the police in his room. And I have no access to them. And so I have access to everyone else in the hospital that comes through the trauma unit, except for that guy. And so when we think about what the whole issue around Black Lives Matter and the fact that the FBI can keep data on just about every single crime in this universe, every single crime, but consciously ignore documenting how many people are involved in police-involved shootings, how many people are wounded, you have to question that. You seriously have to think about, why was that excluded out of all the crimes from the FBI database? Right? And so getting back to these issues of what counts and what doesn't count, clearly we're discounting the lives of young black people when we decide to track them from K through 12 and place them in harsh conditions in the juvenile justice system, push them through adult court, and have draconian policies on the book that place more young black children in suspension, which ultimately leads to school failure, which ultimately may lead to the criminal justice system.
Dr. Richardson, you brought up a good point. Can you just explain a little bit, elaborate a little bit? I was the one that proposed a bill that would require police reporting of police-related homicides, but police-related shootings. What would that data, what would that do for us as policymakers, or even us as in academia? How would that information help us in guiding policy, and what would that lead to? Can you explain the audience to that a little bit?
Well, clearly the issue is this. There are 17,000 law enforcement agencies in this country, and they're not required by federal mandate to support any of the data on police-involved shootings. When it comes to, and I'm going to get to your point, but when it comes to non-fatal shootings, and we know that the majority of people who are shot, there are far more people that survive than live, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We've had improved medical techniques in the trauma unit, et cetera. But what ultimately happens is that we have no idea of how many people are shot by the police, nor do we have an idea of how many people are killed. And that's primarily because, A, law enforcement, why would they want you to know that? And so the ways that it could help, A, we would begin to document and ascertain how many people are literally shot by the police every year, and then that could move into more aggressive policies regarding not only the documentation of it, but the training, the prosecution of police officers, if we were able to have a special prosecutor that specifically prosecuted those cases, and then just to have that data on the books and official data, so I would have a place to make my argument that shootings are not just contextualized as black on black, and a black man shooting another black man in the street, because there are probably thousands of shootings that will never know about, right? That are happening right now in this country. And so for every person that's killed by the police, there are at least 3 people that survive. The ratio is like 1 to 3. And that's probably because police have better aim than the average citizen. Well, the average citizens, it's like 1 to 5. So for every person that's killed, there are like 5 people that survived that gunshot wound. So again, I've pressed at my hospital, and it's a very uphill battle, and I'm presenting this at a conference in the fall, but I've pressed the surgeons at my hospital to document it. But what becomes really problematic is that the health industry and the health sector, they don't want to get involved in law enforcement, right? So the only way that we'll be even able to cross-triangulate and validate whether the documents by the police are actually official, the only way we could document that is the person that's shot will ultimately show up in an emergency room. And so it's the impetus is on the health industry and the health sector to also serve as one of the ways to document that. But we need everyone in this room, to go to their state legislators and to advocate that, one, every law enforcement agency is responsible for having a database to submit that. They have to submit it to the FBI, and then also that there needs to be a standard mechanism for hospitals to report that as well. But that has to be an issue, and it's not an issue that I just think is very important. It's been discussed by Eric Holder, it's been discussed by the FBI director, and we need to get all of the states on board. Yeah.
So I just want to, can I add something
Yep,
real briefly? And just to take it a step further in terms of, I think because we're getting into a conversation about what are some possible solutions and where are folks going to. And something that we're engaged in is in a deeper conversation about why we're here now. Why are we seeing these so many more cases today of police violence and extrajudicial killings and all the levels of impunity? And you know, I oftentimes think back to like the 80s and 90s and the Bush and Reagan years and the disinvestment from public infrastructure, right, from the social safety net, and the investment in apparatuses that criminalize us and really investing in a punishment system. And so I think that's really important for us to kind of hold like the investment piece and the divestment piece. And so the investment piece has also looked like, you might have heard about the broken windows theory of policing. And this theory of policing basically says that in order to address quality of life issues, we need to have more police officers in our neighborhoods, in the streets, really looking at low-level acts of disorder, you know, quote-unquote disorder, or petty crimes in order to stop the escalation of some sort of crime. What this has actually played out as has been the policing of low-income communities, primarily low-income communities of color, primarily Black communities, right? And these interactions that people are having with the police, because they are more frequent these days, oftentimes lead to escalated, you know, interactions, and in cases, and sometimes into death, right? And I think it's really important for us to have that history and to have a little bit of language around broken windows theory, because this is something that was born out of like the late 80s, really invested in the 90s, has been championed across the country, primarily because of Bill Bratton, the police commissioner of New York City, which is where I live. And he has been successful in promoting this theory, and it's a theory that is racist, and it's a theory that was developed off of the Jim Crow logic of policing, right? And basically this Jim Crow environment, which made life for Black people intolerable, right? So the ways in which people are being harassed, very reminiscent of those times. And I think it's really important that we kind of recognize like the 80s and 90s and the neoliberal agenda being really ramped up during that period, and what it has to do with the current climate and context that we're living in right now, because I think that there's a clear connection there. And in New York City, we're actually working on a campaign right now to stop the addition of 1,000 new New York Police Department officers that's being pushed for by the city council right now, actually. So it's going to cost about $100 million each year for the next 3 years. And we've created a campaign, so Baji, Black Lives Matter New York City, Black Youth Project, Million Hoodies, a number of organizations in New York have come together and said, we're going to push back on this notion that our communities need more police. We are actually going to redefine what safety looks like for us. And safety looks like having a good job. Safety looks like not being harassed because you're homeless. Safety looks like not having a cop, being called if you're having a mental health crisis. We actually need caseworkers and public health officials and counselors and so on to actually be addressing those concerns, not police as being the first, respondent. So
Thank you. So we're getting to the bottom of the panel discussion. So I did want to ask one quick question, which it seems like someone actually wanted to ask the same question. And recently, one of our prominent figures here in America said our great African American president hasn't exactly had a positive impact on the thugs who are so happily and openly
Donald
destroying
Trump.
Baltimore.
Can we say who that was?
Donald Trump said this. Yeah, well, it's going to have to be quick. It says, and then also says, why, and another question is for someone in this room says, why doesn't Obama use his star power to calm the violence? And we're going to have to make this quick, so about 30 seconds each in your closing remarks. We'll start down here. Ms. Jasmine.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. The question is, why doesn't President Obama use his star power to calm the violence? And essentially, has President Obama been looked at as this mentor, as this shining light, this beacon of hope for young black men and young black women and minorities? And has it not been effective?
I would say, in my opinion, no, it has not been effective. But I would like to be hopeful that we'll see him utilize more of his executive power, for example. But as it relates to mass incarceration, Obama could do a lot more with his commutations power and his pardoning power, and we're not really seeing a lot of that. So he has been doing some, like he just did 22 commutations a few weeks ago. So it's possible that in these last days of his term, he may be. So I won't say that he will not, but he could definitely be doing more for his executive powers. Now, his star power, that's another thing. I'm more concerned about his executive powers.
Dr. Richardson.
I mean, while I agree that he could be doing more, I mean, some of the policies that he's endorsed, I disagree with. One being the Byrne Grant Act, which is legislation which basically has supported the war on drugs by providing more funding to police departments, which are use that funding to increase the level of arrest. And anyone can look at, Michelle Alexander's talked about it extensively in the new Jim Crow. But another thing I wanted to get to contextualize the broken windows theory. We can't talk about broken windows without talking about it in the context of gentrification, where the police are almost acting as agents of the state for the 1% in the ethnic cleansing of poor black and brown neighborhoods in many major U.S. cities. And so what's happened in New York, and it's in direct correlation because I live there, broken windows was really the impetus of cleaning up neighborhoods in New York City to move gentrification. There's no question about that. And that's happened in just about every city across the U.S. So there's a direct, in my estimation, a direct correlation between the policing of urban communities and housing policies. And we have to be clear about how those two things play a role with each other. But I think that the institutional racism and the policies that are already on the books are much larger than what Obama could possibly ever address.
Thank you. Dr. Bond, 30 seconds.
Okay, so I'm actually not going to address the star power issue because I think there's so much exceptionalism sort of wrapped up in that question about why President Obama does not speak to, for, or at all people, let alone black people in the U.S. So I would maybe underscore Jasmine's point that I'm much more concerned with sort of policy interventions by policymakers than sort of an exercise of star power. But I will spend the last 15 seconds to sort of call back to the conversation that you were just having about data. And just as a resource note for anybody interested, a website created by Janetta Elsie and DeRay McKesson, which provides incredibly detailed information about police violence. It's mappingpoliceviolence.org. It's a composite, I see some head shaking, so people have heard of this. It's a composite data set that they say has been meticulously sourced from the 3 largest, most comprehensive and impartial crowdsourced databases on police killings in the country. These are fatalencounters.org, the U.S. Police Shootings Database, and killedbypolice.net. Those are all resources that you can use to educate yourself on the distributions and on the circumstances of each individual data point that makes up that distribution. It's also an excellent example of the intellectual activism that we're sort of championing today. These are not academics. These are everyday people who use the knowledge and the resources that are around them to create something that's beneficial for the public. It's a real public good.
Opal, last words. 30 seconds.
30 seconds. All right. I think I would just say this, kind of in tangent to what you were asking about President Obama, but I think the reality is that we're living, obviously not in a post-racial society, and that was why Black Lives Matter was very specific in naming Black to respond to the anti-Blackness and as well as to affirm our folk. But the reality is that we're living in a time where white supremacy is being carried out by everybody. Multiracial white supremacy is actually what I've been talking about lately, because I think it's really important. I think Black folks can operate with that. Brown folks can. Asian, all of us actually can operate because it's so hegemonic, right? Because it's so pervasive, because it's an ideological system. It's so pervasive. So I think what's most important is that we, as individuals and as communities, interrogate the ways in which we benefit from or contribute to white supremacy. And from that place, find out why that is, right? And how you can divest from that, how you can challenge that. And that is, I think there was a conversation around solidarity that was kind of emerging earlier. And really, I think folks need to operate from that place, really knowing your privilege, knowing how your communities have benefited from anti-Blackness, and fighting back from that place, and recognizing how white supremacy does a disservice to you and to your communities, because it's selling us all short of our full dignity, and from our relationships to one another. Yeah.
Thank you. So let's thank Delegate Washington for moderating. Let's thank our esteemed panelists. I think this has been wonderful. I want to thank all of you all for staying, especially people who have been here all day, and also the people who are watching on the live stream as well as on chiming in on Twitter. Thank you. Now what we're about to do is transition right below here to the Grand Ballroom Lounge for a reception. So if you're hungry, we have heavy hors d'oeuvres. Go down, get something to eat, and we will continue this conversation by having remarks from Dean Ball as well as others. So thank you.